Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to participate. I've been wanting to come to Lunch and Learns, but Monday noon is not always a good time for me, so it's good. I'll just add a little bit to my own introduction. I have indeed been active with Dying with Dignity for almost 30 years. When I was in British Columbia, I was involved with some choice and dying groups there as well. I worked on implementation with the government on advanced care directives. For our own denomination, we adopted a policy supporting everything from assisted dying to improved palliative care, and I played a role in developing a study guide around that and helping draft the original policy. And then some years later, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was the Senate Commission on Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide, and I was asked to draft the brief on behalf of our church and got to submit it to them. So, and currently I am an official spokesperson of Dying with Dignity here in Edmonton, and so there you go. That's kind of my background. This has been my interest and my passion, but not an everyday passion, because this is an issue, if you follow it at all, that kind of pops up every now and again and then recedes, and pops up and recedes. And now it's popped up in a big way, and now it looks like the tipping point was reached, and those of us who are supporters of this, and I'm making no assumptions about my audience, but those of us who are supporters of this got more than we hoped for, but not everything we want. So we'll talk a little bit about that.
And it's not finished yet.
And it's not finished yet, no. So I'm going to, what I thought is I expect that you all have a great deal to say. So I'm going to catch you up on where things are as I understand it right now, and where I think things are going to go in the next little while. And then I can answer questions. Or we can have a Socratic conversation, as they say. I don't want to just sit here and bore you with facts and figures and things like that. So I'll drop them in, casually into the conversation as needed. So really it comes down to two issues, especially when you're talking to an interfaith group. Should there be assisted dying or not? And there are, on the one hand, religious and moral questions, and those are far from resolved and will never be resolved by institutions, by matters of personal conscience. There will always be people who are deeply convinced that it is a wrong thing to do to help someone over into dying, and I have complete respect for that point of view. And there will always be people who think that it is a good and merciful and kind thing to allow people to die on their own terms, and there always have been. And indeed, if anybody thinks we didn't have assisted dying before the change in the law, you are living in an interesting fantasy world. There have been people who have helped people over at the risk of their own freedom. So the moral question, that's going to stay with us. That's not ever going away soon. Surprisingly, the legal question seems close to being resolved, or at least part A resolved. And it's resolved in a way that there is no going back. The Supreme Court has ruled a year and a half ago in the Carter case that people have a right to assistance, and that the law preventing that is struck down. And they use, and here are the critical words, that people should be allowed to have assistance when there is grievous and irremediable illness. And that's the sticking point. I don't know how familiar you are, so I apologize if this is a bit of a primer. Thanks to the inaction of the Conservative government in the run-up of the election, the 1 year the government was given to bring legislation had to be extended. The Liberals finally tried to bring something out. Their deadline was June 6th, as you all know, I'm sure. They've missed it. They worked on the law C-14 to make it the law of the land, but it is held up in the Senate right now. The critical part about C-14 is it did not do grievous and irremediable illness in the interests of more safety and more safeguards. I'm trying to say this as neutrally as possible. In the interest of more safeguards and more safety, they also include a clause saying that natural death must be reasonably foreseeable. It was very interesting to hear Ms. Carter's daughter say, "That's very interesting, we won the court judgment. Under this new law, my mother would still not be allowed assisted dying." So that is the hassle right now. Uncharacteristically, the Senate is standing up to the government. They have passed several amendments, many of them small, a couple of them useful, that the government are actually threatening to accept. But the big one is they've put grievous and irremediable illness and struck down reasonably foreseeable. That should go back to the government in the next day or two.
Say that again.
They have put in an amendment. The Senate, when they pass their bill, they've already passed the amendment. When they pass their version of the bill, they will have removed reasonably foreseeable natural death and gone back to the Supreme Court wording of grievous and irremediable illness. So they're going back to the intent of the Supreme Court and what activists like myself were hoping for. Or as I used to lament, Justin, they handed you the wording. But I was just reading, I think it was on Friday, that both the health minister and the justice minister think the Senate is meddling, unfortunately. They insist that their bill is reasonable and balanced, and it's likely that the House of Commons is going to reject the Senate amendments, and C-14 will go ahead as promoted and printed. Just as an interesting fun aside in all of that, I noticed in that same article that the conservative interim leader, Ronna Ambrose, agrees that the bill is balanced and fair the way it is, but she's still going to vote against it. Okay.
That's politics.
That's politics. So, and here's the critical piece. If C-14 does pass in its current form, and it looks like it will, there will almost certainly be another court challenge as soon as a case is as appropriate. And not being a lawyer, I can be unequivocal and I can say NC-14 will be defeated because it does not live up to the spirit of the Supreme Court decision. So essentially, Canada is now in a station where, with some limits still to be determined, the right for people to choose the manner of their dying is now the law of the land. And all provinces, and I think all territories, but certainly most, have now put in protocols that are governing the colleges of physicians and surgeons, the nurses and the pharmacists. All of, the government wasn't doing anything about it, but all of these professional associations have been debating this and figuring this out. There is a list of physicians, I haven't seen it, but there is a list of, I'm told, 80 physicians in Alberta who are willing to assist in certain cases. And and this is a piece that will not go back. The Supreme Court does not reverse itself. Whatever your moral position on this, legally this will be acceptable. So I have a couple of editorial comments and then I'll open it up for a conversation. In jurisdictions where it is legal, the Netherlands, Belgium, the state of Oregon, one or two other places, statistically, less than 5% of people who die in a given year, less than 5% opt for assisted dying. Okay? It is not going to be a sudden rush to suicides. And suicide statistics are different from that, of course. Safeguards similar to Canada's have proven very effective in those jurisdictions. There are very few incidents where there have been court challenges afterwards with the suggestion that something inappropriate has happened or that someone has been killed against their will. There are some abuses. I'm not going to pretend there aren't. There are some abuses of any law, period. People break laws. It would be naive to assume that this will be perfect and nobody will ever die against their wishes or something like that. But it's going to be a very, very remote possibility. And we do have a word for a situation where someone who dies against their will. It is still in the criminal code. It is still murder. And if that can be proved, then this, notwithstanding, this act will not apply. If the consents, if the safeguards have been neglected, it will still be a case of murder and it can be tried that way. And then, as I said earlier, there has always been assisted dying. I know of many cases personally over my years working with this. It's naive to think that there hasn't. And now it's going to be regulated with safeguards. I want to close with a story I used to tell a lot more often in the advocacy phase. And that is, in the mid-1980s, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. And she was just past 80 years old. And my mother was not the world's bravest soul. She was afraid of a lot of things, but most of all, she was afraid of pain. And she called me up, knowing that I was involved in this, and she said, "If it comes to it, will you help me?" It could have meant a jail term. I hadn't the first idea how I would do it, but I knew that the important answer was, yes, of course. If you need me, I'll be there and we'll figure it out. And the thing is, I also knew my mother's character. I knew that as long as she was kept relatively pain-free, that she would not ask. And she didn't. She actually had a beautiful death with very little struggle and very little suffering. But I like to believe that telling her she had the out if things got too bad made it possible for her to face it. And that's my deep conviction. And throughout all of this, I have, and most of the people I know in the movement have not simply been advocating for assisted dying. We've also been advocating for improved palliative care, more dollars for palliative care. This province does not have enough palliative care spaces. If you've ever been in palliative care wards, you know the people who work there are just brilliant at what they do. They're kind and gentle, and it is a good place. We need more of them. And if we have good enough palliative care, then I bet we'll never get near that 5% assisted dying. So I'm going to open it up for comments or questions. I expect that you have some, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have.
We state a secondary clause in addition to grievous, the one that the Senate is going to take up. Read that again.
Well, the Supreme Court only said that the standard would be grievous and irremediable illness, which means you're sick and you're not going to get better, but you're not imminently going to die. The government has ignored that in C14 and instead said that natural death must be reasonably foreseeable.
Oh, I see.
Which is not any better defined than that, but typically in other jurisdictions that would mean some doctor has gone on record to say you have less than 6 months to live. But that's a ballpark.
So the question I have is, let's say that in Alberta, the government in its wisdom decides that they can use the Supreme Court's language in their own law, and a doctor assists someone or someone assists someone.
Mm-hmm.
Could they be charged federally?
At the moment, no, because there is no law.
Well, I mean, once there is the law, if it passes the way it is, and let's say I have a disease that I could live for another 40 years with it, but I would be absolutely miserable for the entire 40 years, and somebody helps me die, can they be charged under the current, under C14?
Yes.
They could.
That's my understanding as a minister, not a lawyer.
Yeah.
And you could then be the case that gets that overturned.
That's ridiculous.
It is.
I agree. It's, as I said, in exasperation, they had the language handed to them. Now, the concern, to be fair, is for people who are mentally incapable of making good decisions for whatever reasons, and this is venturing into a realm that I'm not qualified to define. But there certainly is a fear. The other piece that the Senate was doing was allowing it for minors.
Yes, that's what I was
the
doing.
one. Yeah. But there is a concern that this will be an excuse for people to legally commit suicide. And I don't mean assisted with incredible pain and suffering, but will say, I am having such a bad year, I don't want to do this anymore. And I think the theory is, they haven't elaborated, that they believe someone would be able to find a couple of physicians who would say their depression is a grievous and irremediable illness, so here you go, here's your pills, off you go. Okay, if that's your concern, write about your concern. Don't put in this sort of general vague, you actually have to be dying. They could have done it differently if that was a concern.
So there is leeway in interpreting that law.
There is always leeway in interpreting a law, but the thing about natural death is a pretty firm limit, and that's the challenge. Yeah.
My question sort of goes with the mental illness thing, because I have many members on both sides of my family with mental illness,
Mm-hmm.
and some that have threatened suicide. But also, I fear, especially for the one, that if she knew that it was legal, that she could end her life, because she is not going to get better.
Mm-hmm.
None of them are going to get better. And I can see why they would want to end their life, because some of them, there is just really no hope for them. But that's what worries me, is that she could go to somebody and say, hey, I just can't live like this no longer,
Mm-hmm.
and I want my life ended. But she's gone through many cycles like this, and still she's a worthwhile person to be living.
Mm-hmm.
Like for me, I would have a hard time with that. But
Yep.
I just can't, just because you have a mental illness, to say, hey, you're not worth living, we'll assist you in ending your life. I don't know, maybe I'm too close involved with these people, but I would
Nope.
have a heart, because I've talked through many times with her to bring her to a point to see that what she's wanting isn't going to solve her problem. It'll solve her problem, but the problem she's worried about and people she cares about, it's not going to help them. And that's, for her, if you can talk her through it, she doesn't want to hurt them,
Right.
type of thing. But I can surely see and understand why they would want to take their lives. I most certainly can.
Mm-hmm.
It's a terrible illness to have.
Yeah, and generally the people who have been advocating for choice in dying have always included that exception. And one of the language that I cut my teeth on is that it's always had to be someone who is mentally competent. And there are other safeguards stipulated in the law that there have to be two medical practitioners, at least one being a physician, who interviews the client at least twice with some period of time in between. I think they're going to leave that to regulations, but I think it's at least a couple of weeks. But I can certainly understand the concern that someone might be able to find a physician who would say, yeah, we can't do anything for this, and that's a legitimate problem. I would actually like to see the grievous and irremediable illness, but I'd be happy with another clause that's more rigorous about defining mental competence. but that's personal. And you know, this leads, this leads to a very interesting philosophical conversation about, because I know I've presided at the memorial services of a number of suicides, and one of the positions I think the family has to come to is the pain was too great. And we never want to see it happen, but you have to accept it when it does. Well, I had a friend, just a few blocks from here, went off the high-level bridge a number of years ago. And the agony and the angst that caused friends in the search party and family in the search party weeks before his body was discovered was horrible. And there will be some people who will successfully commit suicide. So I don't want to make it easy, but I think it's a conversation, maybe we're not quite ready to have now, but a conversation that we're almost ready to have. Yes.
I'm Dutch, so I didn't say more, but just two comments. Well, the first one is just a scenario that will totally change. The range of questions and situations we'll be facing is going to be expanded. My parents were both card-carrying members of Dying with Dignity. My father had cancer while in this night table, and one night he said, well, this is it. I want to go. My mother at that time, wait a minute. Yes, we had decided this, but not that sudden. Please can we talk about it more? Please can we have at least delay it for another day, so she could prepare herself, have the family together, and that. So they did. And as luck in this case may have it, the next day it was pneumonia and it was never needed. Mm-hmm. So it is a family matter. It's not only the matter of the person themselves. The other one was my mother, who had a stroke, who was in a nursing home, and was offered a nursing home, so there's even a whole bit of a different philosophy there. But at one point, she had become a quadriplegic, and indicated that she wanted to do. Now, what decides and what determines mental competency? She indicated this by not wanting to eat, not wanting to drink, just this is it, thank you very much. The nurse on duty said, we will respect your wishes, but not while you are depressed. I have no idea how she determined that my mother was depressed. And so my mother got fed through the nose with an antidepressant and lived as a quadriplegic for 4 million years, probably in a vegetable state. So those are the scenarios that we may be starting to face. I have no answer to them, although I'm still angry a bit, still have some resentment about the situation of my mother.
Yep.
A few years ago, I went to visit with a friend here, who teaches at the Faculty of Nursing, to the Netherlands, and one special visit we made was to my cousin, who is a physician, has a special task to travel the country and to train or workshop, to inform, advocate for palliative care, which is a special position that he has within the profession to train family physicians in the updates, the new expansion, the new opportunities for palliative care. And he would absolutely say what you already said, is that it certainly is not a first recourse. It's just people have the assurance, so we think, that when they want to go, and there's enough evidence that they have indicated that beforehand and what have you, that it is possible, which gives a tremendous emotional
Peace.
rest.
Yep.
But then again, the last incident is not even foolproof either.
No,
We're still at the whim of some professionals in the field.
and we will never, death will never be entirely clean and sanitary and perfect and one size fits all. It's messy. I have a friend who is now retired, a very close friend, a minister in the Netherlands. She was with reform, I think. And she has been the spiritual caregiver at 2 or 3 assisted deaths. And she said, I have to tell you, it is the most exhausting thing I've ever done. If you think it's easy for people to die, to be killed, to be helped across, you're wrong. It is exhausting for the family. It is exhausting for everybody. The one thing I can assure you, it is not done on a whim. It is not done lightly. And she said she always had to take a day or 2 off afterwards, and refused any cases where the person wanted to die on a Saturday because she went, no, I got to preach on Sunday.
Normally, we have the church, the priest, the dying moment. Now, most people will go to the doctors, the medical staff. Has the doctors from their association had anything to say about this? What is their opinion?
The medical associations uniformly, the National College of Physicians and Surgeons, Canadian Medical Association, and the Alberta Medical Association, because that's where we are, have both said we're okay with this, and they were the ones who, when the Supreme Court started, they went out and started very carefully polling their members, doing detailed training at their medical conferences, working on a policy. So in fact, their policies were in place, and I'm sorry, I don't have the file with me, but you can certainly look up the statement. A few months ago, you may have heard that there was, my friend, the Catholic bishop, is not at all pleased with this turn of events. And he had a press conference that brought in a physician from Stony Point, I guess it was, to say, I will not do this and I will not even refer my patients. And I got to debate him on radio, it was great fun. But the Alberta Medical Association the next day, without naming him, quietly said, any doctor who does not refer their patient for the appropriate legally provided care will be considered to have abandoned their patient and will be liable to sanctions. So he could be charged for professional association for not, even if he doesn't want to do it, nobody's going to force him to do it, that he has to refer that patient to someone else who will assist.
That's the same with abortions too, when that came in. The doctor had to, if he didn't want to do it, he would have to.
Yeah, and that's the same with nurses and pharmacists. Those are the 3 medical branches that are heavily involved in this, and they've all passed those policies. So the doctors are not forced to participate, nor the nurses, nor the pharmacists, but I think the funeral directors pretty much have no choice. But they all have to refer this to people who will assist. So,
Who are willing to assist.
who are willing to assist, yes.
Yeah.
Hello.
I have a comment to make
Please.
to participate in the discussion. And I'm thinking of the personal examples that Henriette has described to us. In my opinion, this is a very important discussion, by the way. Thank you, Netta, and also Mr. Kiely. We met on Saturday, by the way, at Ruth Horn's memorial service.
Friday. Right.
Friday, sorry.
Yep.
I'm Helen Arnott. I'm a retired nurse, I should tell you that. I'm retired for over 20 years and I don't know anything about anything anymore. So I'm just speaking personally. I think it's really important for each of us to have thought this through for ourselves. We are born alone and we die alone. This is not an issue for the medical staff. The doctors and the nurses don't know what kind of a life you have had. They don't know what your own value systems are. You know that. That's one thing I have to say. The other thing is that the most important thing is to discuss this with your family.
Mhm.
And your mother was absolutely right, Henriette, to say to her husband, hey, stop, this includes me too, this is a partnership. So the most important thing is to discuss it with your spouse, your partner, your children, so that they clearly understand where you're coming from, what your value systems are. Then I'll stop in a minute. Over and above that, yes, we honor and respect the expert knowledge of physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, the whole team. And this is an ideal situation. We respect them and we honor their skill and their talent, their education. But we do not, it's not right to put the responsibility for my life on their shoulders.
Mhm.
That is my responsibility to say what I want done in the event of my imminent demise. And it's best if I jolly well consider it now while I consider myself healthy and
Yep.
of sound mind.
Absolutely, thank you. One of the questions that was not addressed in the legislation, the Senate tried to address it, and I can't remember if this amendment passed, but it was also allowing for the consideration of advanced care directives. Have you all heard of ACDs? Okay. And advanced care directives are simple to complete. You don't want to get too detailed, but the Dying with Dignity website has easy ways to help you walk you through it. But everybody says just completing one, even getting the witness signatures, is not enough. You need to take it to your family physician. You need to discuss it with your family, because the default for the medical professionals is if you're not conscious, they're going to ask your spouse or your child or whoever your caregiver is for their guidance. And this gives them clear thought about what you want, or hopefully some clear thought about what your wishes are. It gives them some evidence to stand up to medical professionals who may or may not be willing to do this. But there has to be, the more people know. I mean, the first thing I did when I came to Edmonton in '97 was I found the doctor, well, not the first thing, but pretty soon. I found the doctor, and the first appointment I said, do you accept these? And gave him my advanced care directive, and he said, yes, I do. Put it in the file. And I see it, it's on the screen. And whenever it shows me my little drug thing, there's ACD on file. And so he knows. And the people who are my decision makers have copies of it. And you know, one of the things in our society about not liking death is we're not too crazy about making wills. We're not too crazy about having these kinds of conversations. They're difficult conversations because often children go, Mom, you're going to live forever. And it's like, no, I'm not. I know, but I mean, they don't want to think about you dying. So it's just awkward all around. I grew up as the youngest of 11 cousins, and I had 21 aunts and uncles. All of whom were over the age of 50 when I was born. I spent my life going to funerals, so like death holds no fear for me. It's just, to me, funeral was another word for family reunion. That's when I saw my cousins.
Is advanced care directive the same as the directed care? When I go to the hospital, they immediately ask me, do you have
Goals of care. Personal.
personal directed care? Is an advanced one different?
You know what? I'm going to confess to not being up to date on the term. It changes about every 2 years. But they're essentially the same thing.
The same thing.
The other thing is as we age and need more assistance, it's wise at some point to give durable power of attorney to someone you trust,
Yes.
A durable healthcare power of attorney so that they can make decisions if you have a stroke or something like that. So that's one of the other ones. And again, that might not be the exact term, but that's one you can't just download off the internet. You got to get a lawyer to sign off on that.
But it would be important then for us all to take a look at our directed wills and see if they need updating or changing.
Periodic thing for all end-of-life things are worth,
Looking at.
yeah, I mean, wills are something you should look at every few years anyway, and all the documentation around the end of life.
And personal directives. Usually if you go into a care facility, they will ask if you have that.
Yes,
Oh, they
and,
always do.
It's the law.
yeah,
They always do.
but they will also want it updated too.
Yes.
It's probably time for me to do mine, because I have a sneaking suspicion I may not have updated mine since 1997, so.
And have it accessible as well. Don't hide it.
No.
Don't hide it.
No,
Have it
absolutely.
accessible.
Yeah, I love the concept of putting wills in safety deposit boxes where nobody has the signature or the key. And, you know, it's like,
Everybody in this room should have one, and all your children and grandchildren should have one as well.
When I did that with my children, they got very, very angry with me.
Just like what Mr. Kiely
Exactly.
says. Yeah.
Exactly. And it happens.
How dare you give us a copy of your will and your personal
Yeah.
You know, death, what's that, you know?
Yeah. Well, and my dad, this is,
When we're young.
my dad back in the 60s kept a copy of his will and mom's will in his dresser drawer. Not the full legal one, but a copy, just a photocopy of it. And I mean, I first read my dad's will when I was 9 years old. He said, oh yeah, sure, read it. Because he believed in normalizing death and making it not weird. It's part of life. But people get weirded out. I mean, there are folks who still won't
Good
visit
for you to
anybody in a
know.
hospital, right?
So if you have a personal directive of health care, personal power of attorney, health care, whatever.
Personal directive is, this is my wishes. Personal power of attorney is,
For health care.
and you have the right to enact them for me.
So if you have that, under this legislation, and maybe you know this from what happens at the hospital, let's say you have one of those, and you are in a terrible accident, and you're not conscious, and it says if something like that happens, you don't want to be fit.
Mhm.
Can your person who you've given power of attorney to enforce that the hospital is not allowed to feed you?
Yeah.
But that's not what's happening.
That's my understanding.
They can, so long as there's not a family member that stands up and says, oh no,
Right.
it has to go this other way. That's part of the, sorry, I do look at the hospital, and that's a big part of the challenge. So you recommend, we have to talk with our families about these things,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So often, well, number one, you can talk to your family if you're at a certain age and stage, and you just, I'm ready to go. So if you find me in my apartment, I've had a stroke or whatever, I don't seem to be breathing, don't call an ambulance.
Yeah. Come back in an hour.
Come back an hour exactly, because an ambulance, when they show up, they have to try to fix you. That's their job. You can waive your personal directive and they'll just say, talk to the doctor, I'm doing my job right now, which is trying to get you to the hospital. So that's a big conversation to have with your family that may not be very glad to hear about that.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, the emergency technicians do not get covered with that. But yeah, when I was first involved in activism, one of the things we used to talk about was that physicians would talk to me about was their fear of the 3,000-mile child. When mom's in bed and mom is dying and all the other ones who live around mom are willing to, say they've had their time, the estranged child from 3,000 miles away comes and wants to fix the relationship with this comatose near corpse.
Yeah.
And
That still happens.
and they're the person who sues,
That still happens.
And they can hold it up.
Well, they can.
One person out of like a family of 6 kids.
I'll go to the media, I'm
They-
talking to my lawyer, yep.
They can, however, that can be challenged in court as well.
Would be-
Yeah,
it's-
and
yeah,
reverse,
it's a drama.
yeah.
Exactly, no, of course, it all can be challenged, but
Yeah.
it takes forever and it's pretty ugly for everyone.
In the meantime, the person gets all the assistance that the doctor can give.
That's right.
There's a new hymn in the hymn book. The old hymn was called Blessed Assurance. The new one is called Blessed Consensus.
Well, that's a good song for the grandmas That's a common sense.
Was it insurance?
So it is, the fact that the legal state is changing is not resolving any issues. There are a lot of complications that still will come into play. And I have actually read through all of C14, and it is the framework. There are a whole lot of regulations that have to come in. There are a whole lot of, the professional associations are doing their job, setting up protocols. The provinces are approving those protocols. So the mechanism for providing assisted dying is ready to come online. And there will be tweaks, and but the legal battle, the critical piece of the legal battle is over. Assisted dying is here to stay. How it's going to be defined, how it's going to be enacted, who's going to be protected, what the exemptions are, I don't think we're done with that. But for all intents and purposes, people who are facing irremediable suffering now will more than likely be able to have their wishes. Not all of them, but I'd say a fairly large majority will be able to have their wishes met.
If you have a member of the immediate family who's violently opposed to it, they can hold up the whole operation.
To a degree, although it's not entirely clear. For example, that's one that's not spelled out in the law. But they can certainly challenge it in court, but if the legal precedent is clear, it's a challenge that will not go far, will be resolved fairly quickly. If you have the consent
But that requires a law case that has to go to court.
There'll be at least half a dozen more cases arguing fine points, and the law will eventually become clear, so the lower courts will feel fine saying, well, that's very nice, Mr. Wright, but too bad, so sad, your mom has her choice. And the law supports. What I like about the thrust of the law is it supports the right of the patient. And that's the critical piece of this. And in fact, it was very interesting. I was involved in a conversation, a three-way conversation put on by the Constitutional Law Foundation. I was amazed. There were 200 people showed up for this. And it was myself, there was an opponent who they actually had to fly in from DC, and there was a constitutional law professor about what this would all mean. And the law professor was, C14 hadn't been introduced yet, and the law professor said, look, the Supreme Court decision is clear. There's no going back on this. Now it's just the details. Yeah, there'll be some more cases, but once we get the details worked out. But the biggest thing that we both noticed from the physician saying is the physician who was opposed to assisted dying never took into account the needs or the desires of the patient. It was all about the doctor has to do this, the family has to do that, the law requires this, and it was never asked the patient. It was there wasn't a person in the conversation, and it was shocking to me. So.
Like me, I got a different way than this. Like way my mom lived, and she had ALS, and she didn't end her life. She let God did it, and she was always happy, and she was always smiling, and I really appreciate that, because it makes me feel good, and I know that with myself in my life, I've been suffering in pain sometimes at times, and I feel like what my mom did, she just took it as it is, and if you have God, God gives you peace, and it's like it's, and we all should follow God's law, and it said in the Bible, "We shall not kill." I feel that we shouldn't kill nobody. It's up to God takes our life, and I feel that way, and then when my youngest brother killed himself, our whole family suffered about it, and it really hurts. And I feel about like the way my mom went through. She was always, she never complained at all. She was always happy and smiling and laughing, even when she had ALS, like when she couldn't even talk and couldn't even feed herself, she couldn't even eat, and she was so happy. And it makes me feel really happy that if we have God, we got peace.
And that is a very valid point. It's a wonderful way of being in the world, and for a good portion of the population, that belief will sustain them. Certainly, that was true with my parents, who were both religious, and they both had peaceful deaths. And nothing would take that away from them. But that's not true of all people. And there are even people who are very strong believers in God.
Yeah, I do. I feel sad about that.
Yeah, well, and that's fine. But this is a world where people want to have choices.
Yeah, and it's sad. Really, that's what I feel.
That's fine, and that's fine to feel that way. That's great.
There's a lot of things what's going on in the world, and then it really gets me mad. And I say, okay, if you want to do that, that's up to you.
Yeah. But thou shalt not kill is a bit problematic, since virtually all governments in the world, even very Christian ones, have sanctioned killing in sometimes very many different ways.
It would make it really easy. There's this law right now about this thing about when in your life. I said, if everybody obey God's will, it would be just so simple. Everybody would follow that, and then I don't like the way the government and everybody's fighting about it and arguing about it and this and that. And I said, it gets me mad. I said, just leave it as it is, and just let God look after it. And that's what I feel.
Simple would be a nice way to live.
It would be. Yeah.
Yes?
He's right. If you're educated in a faith, right from the beginning, and you've got the strength, you can live your life through. But if you're not educated that way, then there's whatever the society and the law gives you, and you have to fight your way there. Because the security that you have in the faith, you don't have, so you have to find it somewhere else, and it's lost. What do we do?
Well,
It's
and
really
that's
sad that so many people are going away from reality and from the teachings which have sustained the world for thousands and millions of years, and now there's nothing to sustain some of these people.
well, it's a valid point, but it's also I think a lot of people have lost faith, not necessarily in faith, but have lost faith in religious organizations, since there's not a particularly good track record of governments run according to religious principles. They tend to be somewhat exclusive, and it becomes a question of whose faith is in charge. Yours, mine, hers, and that's not been terribly successful. And so, done.
Well, there's been a little bit of mention of the role of the clergy and in the dying, and that took me back 63 years to when I was just out of theological college 1 year, and I served 6 churches south of Yorkton, all farming country, and I was 25, not much experience, and I got a phone call one evening saying that a 14-year-old girl at the far end of my 6 churches had been taken to Yorkton to hospital and wasn't expected to live. Now, this wasn't a choice situation at all. She was taken sick. But I was asked if I would come to Yorkton, which was 40 miles away, and be with the family. And I was scared. How do you deal with a family that you've met and known for maybe a year? A 14-year-old girl, how do you deal with that with the family? And I really didn't know. got to York and I stayed with the family until she died. We went back to the farm where I stayed with the family for an hour or two and then 25 miles back to where I lived. But the problem, part of the problem for me was, yes, I've been with the family, but the day after tomorrow I've got to conduct the funeral for this girl.
Mm-hmm.
And what do I say and how do I do it? And when you're just out of college, I had an awful lot to learn. And having to do that. And this was one of the first 6 funerals that I'd ever conducted. So it was a real experience, a real growth experience.
But there wasn't an issue about the death.
No, there
Yes,
wasn't an issue
yes.
about the death. She'd taken sick somehow, I'd forgotten how, and died of the illness.
But I can assure you that the one thing that I can assure you that will not make you any happier is that theological schools are not training their students any better today to fix that eventuality. There are some other programs, hospital chaplaincy and stuff that does, and yeah, how to be with people in times of suffering. That's where the denial comes from the children who are far away, who don't want to hear about mom's will, is just this deep sadness of we have a society where we're onward and upward forever, and we try not to, unless you're a gardener, we try not to acknowledge that death is part of life. And I know that there are some people who I've talked to, some elderly people who are feeling very lonely because their children will not support them in decline. And I don't mean not pay the bills or take care of them, but I mean not be willing to talk to them about what it is to lose things, to lose abilities, and this legislation isn't going to make things tidy. It's still about dying, but it is opening some choices. Yes.
I appreciate everything that's been said today. I am a nurse, and I have experience with long-term care, so I've seen a lot of death and dying. And with the current legislation, the key word is competent, right?
Absolutely.
And a lot of people who are in, end-of-life stages in long-term care situations would not be competent to make that decision. And if they didn't have an advance directive to put that forward, they would not fit that. Mm-hmm. I guess my concern is, as our system becomes more and more financially unsustainable, what happens to the people? When does the wording change? You're from competent to inconvenient. Mm-hmm. So that is my concern with the legislation. So as it stands now, it sounds like the only people that are going to be affected are the ones that want to be affected. But going forward, I'm just wondering how that will all end up playing out.
A very excellent concern and legitimate question. And the answer is that we just need to be vigilant about that. And that's one where I would agree with you. If they tried, first off, we haven't defined competent well enough yet. That's one of the pieces that has to be done, is defining what it means to be competent. For example, I'm sure you've known people or had relatives who have good days and bad days. And there are some days where they're absolutely clear as a bell competent, and other days not so much. Yes. And which one rules? So that's a question. The when do people become inconvenient is a legitimate concern that I would fight that against that ever becoming part of it. And you're right, medical care is getting more and more expensive. And at some point in a crippling, I mean, if we were, this is a first world conversation we're having. This is a privileged society conversation. If we were living in Nigeria, you know, the doctors who are dealing with 30 gunshot victims a week are going, I don't have time to talk about this. You know, there are places in the world where the response is not, don't call the ambulance, there is no ambulance to call. So you are a bit of a canary, because I suspect that there will be a time when that financial conversation is going to be part of this. Almost inevitably. When are we going to deny treatment because it's too darn expensive? We've edged up against that in some kinds of illnesses already. And people are going, no, we have to pay for them. And that's an awkward, difficult conversation, because you're playing with the power of people's lives. But it's out there. Maybe it's a conversation in 10 years or 20 years, but it's coming. There will someday be a political limit to medical care. To some extent there already is, but it'll be a broader one. And I don't think I'll be fighting that fight. I don't think I have the energy.
I just want to go back to your comment about conversation within the family. My experience, not that limited over a number of years, has been that where there's been no conversation about death within the family, there's also been no conversation about life. I'm quite sincere about this. That people haven't talked about what are we here for, what's the purpose of life, let's evaluate what we've been doing, where we're going, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves over in Studio A over here that Paul knows only too well on the main floor, and somebody is near death, and we find we've never talked about it, and there's conflict within the family, and the physicians and the nurses and everybody else over there is waiting for consensus that isn't about to come, and they bring in clergy like Dawn or me or somebody else to try to help wade through this. Not an easy matter, but I've discovered that they haven't talked about life. They haven't talked about death. No, I'm not going to talk about death, because that's not a reality. But I'm not going to talk about life either. I'm not going to have a family conversation about things that matter. And I think the two go together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
This whole conversation about life and death happens also within the society. Now, this bill is on top of the surface. I'm teaching at St. Stephen's College, and recently one of our students, he's a therapist at one of the reserves. His observation was that the whole conversation about life and death affects the suicide rate. And the fact that people seem to be, without doubt, thinking easier, more flippantly about life and its value has, to his observation, affected the increase in suicide. And I don't even want to restrict it to the reserve. I don't know if that is at other people's observation. He thought certainly on the reserve it was a factor.
Interesting. I haven't looked at statistics, so that's interesting.
I haven't heard it either.
But it was in a small high school in Ontario where 16 young people committed suicide, and all of the students in the school quit school for the day to have a protest march about it. So it's a real issue. It's a contemporary issue.
I know you're about to bring us to a close, so just before I do that, I'm going to. One of the interesting aspects of this debate is what level are you looking at? You can always look at very ground level individual cases or incidents involving multiple people or the reserve, and come away with a highly emotional reaction to it. And then you can look at it from a somewhat higher policy level that doesn't throw away but diminishes the importance of those individual stories and looks at it a little bit more statistically and what's the best for the most people. Understanding that there will always be people who will be negatively affected or who will abuse the system or what have you. But there are all of the other people as well. And it's very easy to be swayed by the deeply emotional arguments of the one when you have to make policy and laws to affect the many. And there's going to be that tension, and that's probably a good tension because that makes the conversation richer, but it's always going to be.
Thank you, Brian, very much. I'm going to bring things to a formal end.